most important role. They must follow the general interest. Now, they don't do that all the time. When they don't do that, it's our role, I believe, to denounce this. Because general European interest means that the private interest of the lobbies should not prevail. And it is clear that the Commission has the role to mediate, to try to find a mediation between the different interests at stake every time there is a legislation that they are putting forward or a policy that they are promoting. But when they make this mediation, they must keep us as their point of reference, the general interest. This doesn't happen all the time. And here, and I finish, here there is one difference, I think, between the Anglo-Saxon journalism and the European continental journalism that I've noticed. The Anglo-Saxon journalism has the tendency to consider that Brussels is a foreign intruding force into national sovereignty. And this means that the attitude is always against, not only against the fact that Brussels is perceiving a particular interest or a lobby interest, but in general against the European Union, against Brussels. While the continental press feel more that these are our governments. The Council is our governments. The European Parliament is our parliament, and these are our supranational institutions. So they spend public money, but it's the money of all of us. They don't spend. It's like a national government. It's like the British government spending the public money of the British taxpayers. It's right to denounce that when it goes wrong, when they do wrong things, and so they must act for public interest. And I think it's important to overcome this division between this divide between the Anglo-Saxon journalism and the European journalism, and to understand that this is our common interest, and we have to work as watchdog of democracy, also in the EU, not only in our national countries, in our national government. And I think I stop here. Please.
Thank you very much indeed. Look, I think Lorenzo has touched on one of the really key questions about why we've got this day of action today, and that is, how do we, in the circumstances that we have got, which are politically charged, in which there's more spin, there's more intrusiveness on the part of government, there's less capacity of journalists to deal with it, how do we maintain the watchdog role? And I think, there are many politicians who like the idea of a dog as far as the media is concerned, but they only want a poodle and they only want a lapdog. And the real problem is how we get back to being the barking dog that will actually alert the public to the threats to democracy that are often posed by the way governments do their work. Lorenzo, thank you very much for that. And I think one of the things that we want to do is we want to highlight again the fact that with the API and with the JACE process, the European Journalism Centre, we have actually agreed a code of conduct for the media in Brussels, which is an attempt to try to mediate the role of media that are covering the European Union and its institutions and their public interest responsibilities by calling for more openness, more ethical standards and so on the part of media themselves, as well as expecting governments and politicians to do their part. Thomas Hammerberg has arrived. I'm pleased to say I'm going to give you another few minutes to prepare yourself, Thomas, before I introduce you. But I'd now like to ask Lee Phillips from the NUJ to say a few words. The NUJ, National Union of Journalists in Great Britain and Ireland. Today's Fireworks Day, actually, for those of you who don't know. Great Britain and Ireland, in Great Britain, not in Ireland. In Great Britain, they celebrate today by burning bonfires, an attempt to sort of bomb the Houses of Parliament by a Catholic plot many hundreds of years ago, although it's often said that Guy Fawkes, who's the person who's put on the top of the bonfires, is the only person who entered the Houses of Parliament in Britain with honourable intention. But they've used that day today to try to highlight the issues, and the NUJ in Brussels has been a real strong supporter of the work that we're doing, so I'm pleased to give Lee the floor.
All right. Yes, my name's Lee Phillips. I'm the membership secretary for the NUJ here in Brussels. As we just heard, threats to journalism are everywhere, from slashing editorial departments to cutbacks dressed up as new media innovation to the growing power of lobbyists. And of course, Brussels isn't immune from these phenomena. I was asked to speak about the specific issues that we deal with as journalists here in Brussels, and in particular, how young journalists are dealing with these issues in the city. I think we have to look at how around the world papers in general are cutting back or shutting down their foreign bureaus. Furthermore, even as Europe grows, there's actually a decline in the number of journalists here, as news outlets cut back on coverage of European institutions. Here we only have a relatively small number of EU specialist publications: the EU Observer, Euractiv, the European Voice, Europolitics, the Parliament, and so on, which in turn have relatively few readers. They're important readers, policymakers, various sector stakeholders, researchers, and lobbyists as well. But again, the relatively few readers. So this means that such publications depend on alternative business models, because advertising revenues will be relatively weak. Additionally, much of this advertising money comes from the very institutions, lobbyists, corporations, think tanks, and so on, that we as journalists are supposed to be covering in a neutral fashion. Both our news sources and the advertising sources can sometimes be the same person or the same organization. Publications also often depend on sponsorships, conference spin-offs, or partial commission funding. And there's pressure on journalists to service these partners, with the commercial and editorial departments often in the same room or blurred entirely. Now, there are a few examples that we've come across of copy being changed at sponsors' request, but there is a more general worry of a lack of independence for journalism if sponsors and journalists get too close together. To some extent, this is an old story. The self-censorship or scissors in your head of any journalist for working for a publication depending on advertising. This is not something that's unique to Brussels. But we depend on decades-old principles of journalistic ethics to ensure that journalists stand up to these commercial pressures on our output. And the pressures here in Brussels are particularly fierce. I think when we begin to talk about young journalists, I think we have to look at how scarce the jobs are out there these days, and the increasing number of young people who really want to have a job in the media. This means that there are many more young journalists leaving journalism schools, leaving universities, even colleges, than there are jobs out there. With increasing scarcity or increasing insecurity in jobs, this means that journalists, young journalists, and journalists in general, will increasingly be less able to stand up for these decades-old principles of journalistic ethics, and more willing to compromise for the sake of keeping their job. I think this is a particular problem for freelance journalists and young journalists just starting out. I think there are three problems in particular that I wanted to talk about. One is the issue of basically work for no pay, the faux indépendant, or the fake freelance, and thirdly, the intern as essentially full-time worker. One of the most again, as journalists are so keen to get a job, young journalists, they're very increasingly willing to work for no pay, sending off copy on the slim hope that maybe, just maybe, your copy will make it into a publication. This puts enormous pressure on all of us who try to work for a living, and enormous pressure on freelancers in particular. It pushes down the rates that we're able to get for our work, and essentially it diminishes the amount of work out there that is paid. Secondly, I think one of the most pernicious problems that we face is, again, this problem of the faux indépendant, which is somebody who is hired but is not really employed. They effectively work full-time but without full-time benefits or full-time protections, and can be fired at any time. This lack of security, lack of social security as well,